Did you ask your mom? Did you ask mom about the person whose wife is sick? She's a wife. Like she sent him a case of cherries. Hey, here, it's a beauty day. Hey, let me talk about cherry.
Drink coffee?
Yes. Growing up for the old days.
I like that.
Yeah.
I just had to put my one horse down. Inherited. I grew up on horses. Hey, don't you say he was real lean and he wasn't made for it anyway. Rebuilt.
Well, I mean, it is right.
I gave
Give me two.
Help me get that coffee. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's what I say. That was a great chat. Sorry.
They're nice and warm.
All right, good morning. We need to go ahead and get started with our Bible class. Are there, and we'll be in, I know we've skipped around a few chapters, so for those of you that don't know, we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 10 today. Are there any announcements before we get started, though?
I'd like to ask for prayer for Norm Smith and his wife. She's had shoulder operation.
Okay.
Norm is where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Actually, my understanding is she didn't have shoulder surgery. They postponed it, but it keeps changing. So, okay, I've been gone for a few days, so.
People helping and rehabilitation. You think she can come home right now, but she can't.
Okay, well, yeah, Libby
A
is,
little bit of time of transition.
yeah. The last I knew, they were looking for
Sounds
PT.
good on the phone.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my phone.
My brother's coming home tonight or Monday morning at 3.
Where's he been? Somewhere?
California, right in Washington.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know he was in the lower 48 right now. So, okay.
We're going to visit Norman this afternoon and take him to White
Okay. Well, I have announcements, so this is all useful stuff. I'll let everybody know before we start worship. Yeah. So. All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer before we dig into 1 Chronicles chapter 10. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have to gather here today and to study your word. We thank you for blessing us. We thank you that you provided your word, that we can learn more about you. We ask that you would be with those that are traveling. We have numerous travelers mentioned in our bulletin and probably additional folks that are traveling in many events coming up soon. We ask that you would be with us in those events and help us to enjoy time with one another and fellowship. Be with those that have been in our prayers for medical concerns. Be with Norman and Libby as they continue to deal with health struggles. Be with the Morrisons as they continue to go through problems. Also keep Nancy. Be with Nancy Chambers and her mom with the difficulties that she's having. Be with those in war-torn areas and in areas of the world where being a Christian is not readily accepted. Thank you for the blessings that we have in that regard and the ability to gather here. Help us not to take them for granted. Be with each of us in the individual struggles that we face. Help us to draw closer to you. These prayers and thanks we give in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, this is a really short chapter. Which works out well because I just got home last night. I've been gone for 3 days. So it's also interesting because I'm reading all these notes and they're not in my handwriting because I dictated everything to my wife as we were coming down the highway from the valley yesterday. And so I'm like, well, find which chapter that happened in. Write that down. Not the way I usually do my preparation for a Bible class, but it worked. And like I said, it's a short chapter, but between this chapter, which is chapter 10, and next chapter, chapter 11, 2 Samuel had 4 chapters. So there's a lot of events that happened in between, and if time permits, we'll get into some of those before we get into all the details that 2 Samuel included. I want to hit on a few other points first, and then we'll get into that if we have time. Because we just finished up Samuel and Kings, so we've heard those stories very recently. So a lot of this will be very familiar. And so if I don't have time to get to that, it's going to be something we studied fairly recently, the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel. But I'll start. I'm just going to read through this chapter since it's short. And then there's a few points that I want to pull out of it. And then if we have time, we'll get into the events that happened between this chapter and next chapter. So now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard after Saul and after his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was wounded of the archers. Then said Saul to his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. So Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise on the sword and died. So Saul died, and his 3 sons and all his house died together. And when all the men of Israel that were in the valley saw that they fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, then they forsook their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. And when they had stripped him, they took his head and his armor, and sent it into the land of the Philistines, and round about to carry tidings unto their idols and to the people. And they put his armor in the house of their gods, and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. And when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, they arose, all the valiant men, and took away the body of Saul and the body of his sons, and brought them to Jabesh, and buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his transgression which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he had kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him, and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. So this is, like I said, it's a parallel with 1 Samuel 31, which is the last chapter of 1 Samuel. It isn't quite word for word, but a lot of the verses are literally word for word. But in reading through this, I had a few questions, a few things that stood out. And I had looked at the 1 Samuel passage, and there's some differences, and some of those pertain to some of these questions. If I can find it. For example, here it talks about in verse 13 that Saul died for his transgressions, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. So we've heard that story, how Saul didn't necessarily follow the words of the Lord very well. And that particular verse is not in 1 Samuel 31 that explicitly states that's why he died. But it does match up with what we'd see. So I thought we would look at some of that. And I managed to find, of course, it specifically mentions when he asked counsel of a familiar spirit, but then it also says that he did not keep the word of the Lord. And so I was able to find two occasions. I'm not sure if it's speaking of one in particular or if there were multiple occasions, but I found two different occasions where it's mentioned that Saul did not keep the commands of the Lord. And the first one is in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And we'll start in verse 8 and following. It says, "And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over the people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." So in this case, Samuel, who was the priest and the one authorized to do these sacrifices, didn't come in the 7 days when he was supposed to be there. And rather than wait, Saul took it upon himself to offer the sacrifices, which was not the role of a king. That was a role for the priest. And it doesn't really sound like Samuel was that late, because they waited the 7 days according to the set time. But when he wasn't there, Saul goes ahead and offers the sacrifice. And it says as soon as he finished offering the sacrifice. So in my reading of that, it sounds like it's still on the seventh day. It's just seventh day gets, Samuel's not here. Oh, let's offer a sacrifice. I don't know how long it takes to offer the sacrifice. I mean, you got to kill some animals and clean some animals. I mean, that takes a few hours. But it sounds like it's still in the same day. Samuel shows up. This has already been done. Samuel was running a little bit late, but it doesn't really give me the impression reading this, and maybe I'm reading it wrong, but it doesn't really seem like they even gave Samuel an extra day. When he wasn't there on the seventh day, it's like, oh, I'm going to do this. And so at that point, Saul was told that his kingdom would not be established. So that doesn't necessarily say he would die for that transgression, just that the kingdom wouldn't continue in his lineage. But if we follow, there's another time that distinctively notes that Saul transgressed, and that is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let me see. Well, I guess I'll just read the whole chapter. Samuel also said unto Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over the people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have. Spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep and camel and ass. So Samuel tells Saul that the Lord has commanded for them to completely wipe out Amalek, which Amalek, and I remember when we studied this, had attacked Israel when they were leaving Egypt, which is what it says here. They laid in wait for Israel on the way. And at that time, it was prophesied that they would be wiped out at some point in the future. And so God has decided it's time to fulfill that prophecy. And he gives Saul that opportunity to do that. And I'll skip a few verses where Saul gathers the people together and has the battle just for time's sake. And picking up in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 15, it says, And Saul smote the Amaleks from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amaleks, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuge they destroyed utterly. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. And when Samuel arose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a place, and is gone about, and passed on, and is gone down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said unto him, Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites. For the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said unto Saul, Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord hath said to me this night. And he said unto him, Say on. And Samuel said, When thou wast little in thy own sight, wast thou not made head of the tribe of Israel's, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? And the Lord sent thee on a journey, and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners of the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be utterly consumed. Wherefore then did thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but did fly upon the spoil, and did evil in the sight of the Lord? Then Saul said unto Samuel, Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, and chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great of delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath rejected thee from being king. And Saul said unto Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord, and thy words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin, and turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said unto Saul, I will not return with thee, for thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected thee from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned about to go away, he laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it rent. And Samuel said unto him, The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. And also the strength of Israel will not lie nor repent, for he is not a man that he should repent. Then said he, I have sinned, yet honor me now, I pray thee, before the elders of my people, and before Israel, and turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord thy God. So Samuel turned again after Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, Bring you hither to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately, and Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, As thy sword hath made woman childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag into pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. And the final sin of Saul that was mentioned was the familiar spirit, which is in 1 Samuel chapter 28. And the events of this chapter actually happen right before the campaign, the military campaign in which Saul was killed in. Let's see. I'll start in verse 3. It says, Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Then said Saul unto his servants, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go unto her and inquire of her. And his servants said unto him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and went, and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits, and wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life, to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me. And he answereth me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called thee, that thou mayest make known to me what I shall do. Then said Samuel, Wherefore then doest thou ask me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thy enemy? And the Lord hath done to him as he spoke by me, for the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thy hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David. Because thou hast obeyed not the voice of the Lord, nor executed his fierce wrath upon the Amalekites. Therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. And the Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. So we see here that in this case, once he uses a medium to call up the ghost of Samuel, which was not allowed by God's law, that Samuel told him this was because of his not keeping the Lord's commandments and slaying all the Amalekites. And it cites here that because of him not keeping the counsel of the Lord and using the medium was why he died. Interestingly enough, it does say in verse 14 of today's chapter that he inquired not of the Lord, therefore he slew him. But it does seem that at the end of his life, he tried to turn back and call on the Lord, but the Lord had already had stopped answering him, which seems unusual. At least stopped answering him via prophets and Thummim and dreams. So he stopped answering him in the ways that he had before. And so Saul chose to consult a medium. And the Chronicle gives this as the reason that he he died in battle right after doing this. So that's one of the things that I wanted to look at was, since it cited that Saul died for his sins, I wanted to look at those. Does anybody have any questions regarding those before we move on? All right. The next thing that I thought I'd look at is, so the Philistines kill Saul, or rather he commits suicide in battle, kills his son, and they take him off. They hang his head in their temple wall. They have his armor. That was kind of their way of sending it around their villages. It's like, look at what we've done. We've killed the king of Israel. But it's interesting, and many of you may remember this story, but the men of Jabesh Gilead, which is a town in Israel, heard what the Philistines had done. It says they arose, all the valiant men, and took away the body of Saul and the body of his sons, and brought them to Jabesh, and buried their bones, and fasted for 7 days. And for those of you that remember, the people of Jabesh Gilead had a particular reason for wanting to honor Saul. They were involved in his becoming king. He had saved them. And that story is in 1 Samuel. Most of it's in chapter 11, but we'll back up into 1 Samuel chapter 10. And it'll give us some insight into why the people of Jabesh Gilead were the ones that went and rescued Saul's body and gave him a proper burial. And they had played a major role with him actually taking the throne after he was anointed. 1 Samuel 10, starting in verse 24, it says, And Samuel said to all the people, See ye him whom the Lord hath chosen, that there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom, and wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gibeah. And there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched. But the children of Belial said, How shall this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no presents, but he held his peace. So the context here is Saul has just been anointed to be king. They kind of anoint him, and then they all just go home. And it's kind of like, well, he's anointed king, but he isn't really king, doing anything kingly. Everybody's like, okay. And some people follow him, and some people are like, there's no way he's going to be king. And so in chapter 11 here, we'll see how he came to be. Everybody accepted him as king, and the role that Jabesh Gilead played in that. So 1 Samuel chapter 11. Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, Make a covenant with us, and we will serve thee. And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, On this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes, and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel. And the elders of Jabesh said unto him, Give us 7 days' respite, that we may send messengers unto all the coast of Israel. And then, if there be no man to save us, we will come out to thee. Then came the messengers to Gibeah of Saul, and told the tidings in the ears of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices and wept. And behold, Saul came after the herd out of the field. And Saul said, What aileth the people that they weep? And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. And he took a yoke of oxen, and hewed them in pieces, and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. And when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they said unto the messengers that came, Thus shall ye say unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, Tomorrow, by the time that the sun be hot, ye shall have help. And the messengers came and showed it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, Tomorrow we will come out unto you, and ye shall do to us what seemeth good unto you. And it was so on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together. And the people said unto Samuel, Who is he that said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in, that we may put them to death. And Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. Then said Samuel unto the people, Come and let us go to Gilgal, and renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. And there they sacrificed sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So Saul's kingship over Israel had been affirmed when he had saved the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had been sieged basically by the Ammonites, who had agreed they would make peace with them if they would, let them put out their right eye on every one of them, which would, make them unsuitable for battle. You don't have depth perception. Typically, it's the shooting eye if you're an archer, although I suppose some people, just like rifles, could shoot left-handed, but it seems kind of like most of them wouldn't, and with one eye, no depth perception. So Saul had saved them, and so in the end, when Saul was killed and his body was hung on the temple wall, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead that arose and went and recovered the body of Saul and his sons and gave them a proper burial. So that's another story that I wanted to look into out of this chapter. And that kind of leaves me with the story in between, of which I doubt I have time to read all 4 chapters of the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel, which are inserted between this week's chapter and next week's chapter, since Chronicles tells a much shorter version of the story. There's 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it's telling the story that's given in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So in 2 books, it's telling the story that was told in 4 books before. So, of course, there are some details omitted. But to somewhat summarize it, as we will recall, after Saul's death, David became king over the tribe of Israel. And Saul had a remaining son who was king over the other tribes, but he never really, he was kind of a puppet king, I would say, under Abner, which had been Saul's commander of the army. And he didn't last long, and he didn't do much. And after his death, the whole nation of Israel gave their allegiance to David. And under David and Solomon, as they had been with Saul, they were a united kingdom. And then we will see the dividing of the kingdom after that. Like I said, I don't really have time for that whole story. I think we studied it recently enough that we are all familiar with it. But I did want to look somewhat into the genealogy of Saul, because there is some confusion here, because it says, which verse is it? Where it says that Saul and all his sons had died. Verse 6 says, So Saul died, and his 3 sons and all his house died together. And it did in verse 2 list his 3 sons that were killed by the Philistines: Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchijah, the sons of Saul. So the confusing part is verse 6 that says all his house died together. And there are numerous theories as to why it says that, as to whether that's misworded or not. We do know, obviously, that one son survived. There are genealogies given for Saul's family in a few different places. The confusing part is they have different names. So it leaves scholars to be like, well, did these people have multiple names? Which is quite possible. We've seen that with some people that went by a couple different names? Or were there just that many different sons? And I don't necessarily have answers to it. I've done some research on it. And of course, people have a lot of opinions about it. But the first thing that I found a scholar to say that I think is noteworthy is that other than the end of this, much of what is written in First Chronicles is almost word for word what was written in 1 Samuel chapter 31, but there are some differences. And of course, there's disagreements, and we've been studying this as we started into Chronicles. Some people feel that Chronicles and Kings were written at the same time. Other people feel that Chronicles was written later. So some people believe that the Chronicle just simply, the chronicler, or however you would say that, simply copied what was written in 1 Samuel for most of this story. That may have been his source for it. And in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 6, it says, "So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men that same day together." And so it's verse 6 in both chapters, whereas in Chronicles it says all his house, whereas in 1 Samuel it says all his men. So some people believe that was simply copied differently, and that would make sense because all his men were killed in battle and his 3 sons, but those obviously were not all his descendants because we have mention of other descendants. So that would somewhat explain this. The 3 sons that are listed as being killed are the same names in both 1 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. And if we go to the places that list the genealogy of Saul, the first one is in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and it gives 3 names. I'll back up and give it some context here. So 1 Samuel 14, starting in verse 47, it says, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the children of Zobah, and against the Philistines. And whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. And he gathered a host, and smote the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hand of them that spoiled them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishui, and Melchushi. The names of his 2 daughters were these: the name of the firstborn Merab, and the name of the younger Michal. And the name of Saul's wife was Ahonam, the daughter of Hamazah. And the name of the captain of his host was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle." So we see here we have 3 sons listed: Jonathan, Ishui, and Melchijah, or Melchijah. And the ones listed as being killed in battle, it gives as Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchijah. So 2 of those names are the same as what was given here. And of course, we know that the son that became king for a few years after Saul's death was Eshbal. And this is where you'll find scholars almost evenly divided, whether Ishui, who was named there in 1 Samuel 14, was Eshbal under a different name, or whether that was Abinadab. I kind of think after having studied it, that that was probably Abinadab, because Abinadab was killed in battle here with Saul. He was always listed as fighting with Saul. And where you see this genealogy in 1 Samuel, that's why I read several verses around it, it's naming his sons that fought with him, because it's talking about how his military campaign was organized. It goes on, it names his sons, it names who his commander of his army was, and was telling what enemies he was defeating. Yeah.
First Chronicles 8 gives the genealogy of Saul.
Mm-hmm.
In 8:33 starts off, Ner was the father of Kish, Kish of Saul, Saul of Jonathan, Melchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that I was getting to that.
Okay.
There are two places in First Chronicles, both in chapter 8 and chapter 9, that name the descendants of Saul, and they name 4 sons. There is that one in 8, starting in verse 33, that lists those sons. And then in First Chronicles 9, starting in verse 39. It says, and Ner begat Kish, Kish begat Saul, Saul begat Jonathan, and Malchishua, and Abinadab, and Eshbaal. So again, it kind of seems that kind of seems to tie in with Abinadab maybe being a Shui. In both cases, it gives Eshbaal, which the son that became king was Ishbosheth, which some people believe may be a different pronunciation of Eshbaal. And so in those cases where it lists the 4 sons, that makes sense because it listed 3 that were killed in battle. And the part that confuses people is because 1 Samuel only listed 3 sons. As I said, I kind of feel like, and many scholars feel like, the reason it only listed the 3 sons here in 1 Samuel is because it's talking about his military campaign. And there were 3 sons that fought with Saul in battle. They were killed with him in battle. And as we kind of saw of Ishbaal or Ishbosheth, which became king afterwards, he kind of was a nobody and kind of a pushover. And Abner kind of placed him on the throne. And Abner was the military man and pretty much the man. And this guy was just kind of a wimp. So it makes sense that he may not have been part of the military campaigns at all. We also know that Saul had other descendants that were not through his wife. And we learn that in 2 Samuel 21. If we go to 2 Samuel 21, we see some people that ask for descendants of Saul to be killed. And David does his best to grant that request and keep his promise to Jonathan. So 2 Samuel 21 says, then there was a famine in the days of David, 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. And the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them, now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnants of the Amorites, and the children of Israel had sworn unto them, and Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And wherewith shall I make an atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said unto him, we will have no silver or gold of Saul, nor of his house. Neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. And he said, what shall you say that I will do for you? And they answered the king, the man that consumed us and devised against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coast of Israel, let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will hang them up under the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them and between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. But the king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ahai, whom she bore unto Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. So there is mention that Saul had a concubine and 2 sons that weren't through his wife. So there are some scholars that think Eshbaal, since his name is different, Eshbaal which is listed in Chronicles, was not actually Ishbosheth, which became king, but that Ishbosheth was another descendant from a concubine, but we have no evidence to support that. But again, Eshbal and Ishbosheth are a similar enough name that I kind of believe that's that they're the same person. And I also believe that Abinadab and Ishui were two names for the same person, just because of where they're listed. But there are a lot of biblical scholars that disagree. There are people that are like, every one of these was a different person, and Saul had at least 7 children. There are multiple names given, but like I said, we've seen a lot of times where people went by more than one name. And certainly here in Chronicles, it lists 4 sons, which would match the story, because it lists 3 that were killed in battle in both Samuel and here in Chronicles, and 1 that became king for about 2 or 2.5 years after Saul, before the whole kingdom was united under David. Does anybody have any questions before we finish? All right. That's about as much as I can pull out of a 14 verse long chapter. So I appreciate it.